We're on? All right. Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and I have the great pleasure to accompany the games launch tonight with a few reflections on the related to the aforementioned essay or polemic I wrote on the anti-politics of cooperative games. And the key difference I want to reflect on tonight is the difference between what we could call apolitical and anti-political games. And up front, the talk is embedded in wider research on the socioeconomic feasibility of market abolitionism and AI systems planning. So this is my PhD research, but I got drawn more and more into the question of games as well, because I think what both relate is that the core of my inquiry is really the general concern that to ask what form political conflict might take in an association of free individuals once the revolution has succeeded and the antagonist has been defeated. So putting it differently, to ask how could post-revolutionary discord be modeled in the format of a serious game? And is it possible in there to embed agonistic principles, that is a positive notion of conflict and struggle, within a wider framework of cooperation? Or must we accept these modes as something fundamentally contradictory forces within the game space, but also in real life? And from here on out, apologies that I will read out. I got a little demon at home stealing my sleep and melting my brains, so I prepared a little talk, so it would be more of a lecture setting going on. So before we delve into these questions, let me allow to begin on a darker note with a poem Bertolt Brecht dedicated to Walter Benjamin, a year after the latter took his life on the night of September 26, 1940, when the French authorities denied him passage to Spain, and he feared imminent deportation to the Gestapo. Part of why I'm sharing this with you is the gloom I've been feeling in recent months, and the fear that we are once again living through a historical moment in which it might take very little, and some of us might fall victim to the same forces that destroyed Benjamin. Disregarding the blaring of alarm bells, we continue to sleepwalk into fascism. Yet the poem offers more than a warning. It reveals something more general about the relationship between games and ideology through the metaphor of chess, which marked their time together in Brecht's exile in Svendborg, Denmark, until Benjamin's path was tragically cut short. I will read the poem in German. I got the English translation through the right because translating poems is always a difficult thing, and I think a lot gets lost on the way. An Walter Benjamin, der sich auf der Flucht vor Hitler entleibte. Ermattungstaktik war's, was dir behagte, am Schachtisch sitzend in des Birnbaums Schatten. Der Feind, der dich von deinen Büchern jagte, lässt sich von unsereinem nicht ermatten. Who is Brecht addressing here with unsereinem, the likes of us, intellectuals hiding in exile, lacking the courage to die in heroic death as partisans? One can sense a guilt of the survivor here, but there's also something deeper. Even as an enjoyer of tactics of attrition on the board, there's a disjunction. Something not allowing Benjamin to translate his lust for ludic violence into physical resistance. Not because resistance was futile, but I would argue because his humanism, that is undoubtedly a socialist one, and has the universal love for mankind at its core, did not allow him to inflict the violence to others that he was receiving. His bloodless ideal of divine violence has left him with no other option than to spill his own blood. And there lies as well a mischievous pleasure in the play with symbolic guillotines, but the thought of escorting actual billionaires to the scaffold reminds something repugnant and deeply alien to myself, and hopefully also to you guys. By contrast, the move from fascist politics to death is short. Once social hierarchies are reified and the other is dehumanized, the leap to physical elimination becomes effortless. This is why the political playing field has never been level. Moreover, there seems to exist a structural kinship between ideologies grounded in hierarchy, fascism, feudalism, capitalism, and competitive violence in games. They seem to gravitate toward one another. The real question, however, is in what ways do they also reinforce each other? What is so wonderful about games is that they allow us to experience such existential question more visceral than any other form of art, as through our engagement with them, we truly have to embody their moral cosmos. To play a game is to enact a value system imposed by its rules. Taking the seemingly innocent games of musical chairs, where each round another player falls victim to a missing chair until the last person claws their way to victory. The logic of social Darwinism seems to be encoded into our ludic culture and normalized through play. What does this game stand for, if not racial struggle or the ruthless competition on the market? In Germany, it's called Die Reise nach Jerusalem, the trip to Jerusalem. And under the dire conditions today, I cannot help but to unsee Gaza here. Regardless that the name predates Zionism and likely stems from the Christian Crusades, it still creates a tainted harmony between signifier and signified. The game's logic eventually represents the abyss of humanity we are forced to witness daily in the ongoing massacre and land grab of what is left of Palestine. And yet, we find in a cooperative variation of the game an emphatic counter-image. Instead of eliminating players, the winning condition becomes the joint effort to fit the player group on a decreasing number of chairs. Even when your elbow is causing me some pain, I'm willing to take the sacrifice to uphold the integrity of a political community. Isn't this a hopeful image and a wonderful use of pedagogy? That this symbolizes also the longing for a just peace and a possibility of coexistence between Muslims and Jews should be obvious. For stories like this, it is understandable why the turn towards cooperative games has been so pronounced on the left in recent decades. Culture is formed through practice, and games, like any medium, carry pedagogical weight. There are no apolitical games, as Max Haven rightfully argued in a recent piece for Jacobin. Even the appearance of an indifferent disengagement from politics does not make games neutral conduits. In the struggle for cultural hegemony, there also exists, of course, a long tradition of the instrumental use of the arts to shape political consciousness. At its worst, this yields socialist realism, force-feeding collectivism without democracy to the masses. But it can also take more subtle forms, like Brecht's aesthetic strategy of Umfunktionierung, functional distransformation. According to Benjamin, this encompasses not simply the use of culture to transmit socialist ideas, but the technical imperative to restructure the apparatus of cultural production itself. An instance for this is Brecht's radio theory, which aimed to elevate the passive listeners to active broadcasters, anticipating already early net utopianism. Cooperative games must be understood as part of this broader tradition, and there is certainly a merit in their pedagogical use. However, in many cases, I find them rather pedantic, and most lack the intensity and thrills of their competitive counterparts. While that may be a matter of taste, I remain skeptical also of their efficacy as a ludic strategy in a culture war we are currently losing. In leftist game worlds, once the revolution succeeded, there seems to be no more space for ludic violence. But we have to ask ourselves whether we should leave it with this simple dichotomy of equating cooperative games with the left and competitive games with the right, or whether we can come up with ways of integrating agonism into a wider framework of cooperation. Instead of repressing, castrating, negating, cleansing, or othering these flows, as good Hegelians, we should think about ways to sublate this primal drive and integrate it back into an emancipatory project, because what cooperative games offer us in the end is a form of anti-politics that sidelines political conflict. And this is, by the way, also a defect of the literary genre solar punk, which is grounded in the creation of fantastic worlds free of existential conflicts, lovely perhaps, but narratively rather flat. So on the surface, cooperative games are certainly political. They teach moral values, they instill solidarity, but on a deeper level, they are inherently anti-political in their hostility towards political struggle, which might demand a short digression into political theory by briefly introducing two critical concepts. So what we do right now is Carl Schmitt and Rousseau in 3 minutes, and starting with Carl Schmitt's notion of the political. The idea with Carl Schmitt is that without differences, there's no politics. So in Schmitt, the political emerges from division, not from unity. Following this premise, its basis is the friend-foe distinction that still exists in domesticated form in peacetime. Think about political competitors, rival parties, the marketplace of ideas, or ideological camps of the aforementioned culture wars. With Schmitt, a solution to this conflict can only be the hegemony of one particular view dominating the others. The more progressive theory of agonistic democracy has adopted the Schmittian notion of the political as a starting point and is characterized by 3 basic elements according to Max Grünberg. First, it relies on a conception of constitutive pluralism, so value pluralism. Second, a tragic vision of the world. That means there will be no salvation, that even the revolution won't bring us salvation. The political struggle, conflict will keep on. And the third one is that is a belief that conflict can be a political good, so a more positive attitude towards conflict as such. The fundamental difference between fascism that might becomes right and agonism lies in the conceptualization of the relation to the other. In Chantal Mouffe's agonal pluralism, for instance, the other is no longer seen as an enemy to be destroyed, but an adversary, that is, somebody with whose ideas we are going to struggle, but whose right to defend those ideas we will not put into question. That's a quote from Chantal Mouffe. Yet the danger that this deteriorates again into violent conflict is always present. The slide from adversary to enemy is completed when the destruction of the other becomes tied again to the realization of one's own political goals. Today, we are witnessing this, for example, when Trump labels his political opponents as enemies of the state. In contrast, the second concept I want to introduce is another very influential way of thinking about politics, that is Rousseau's conception of the general will. Here, the principal purpose of any political community becomes the formulation of a general will, which for Schmitt remains an ideological fiction bound at best to the relatively small and homogeneous citizen assemblies of ancient Greek city-states that, of course, can practice this kind of democracy, or could have practiced this kind of democracy as well, only because they had the slaves running the economy. A more optimistic view on its realization can be found today, for instance, in the idea of deliberative consensus processes by the likes of Habermas or even John Rawls' notion of overlapping consensus. What is important is that in Rousseau, the general will is neither a dominant particular view nor an aggregate of all individual desires, but the expression of a general interest, or in other words, the common good, that emerges by taking away, and I quote Rousseau's social contract, by taking away the pluses and minuses of particular wills which cancel one another out. The general will remains as the sum of differences. So what is eventually political, according to Rousseau, is the process of discovering the general will in the first place, and of course defending it against a fragmentation. And this is the point where I want to come back to games. And returning from political theory, most cooperative games are neither concerned with conflict between players nor the formulation of the common good, but take the latter for granted. By aligning everyone to serve a goal set by the game's designers, it represses political conflict between players and turns them into organs of a unitary subject, soldiers of the general will thrown into a struggle with their environment, regardless whether this is the slaying of dragons, decolonial resistance in Spirit Island, containment of pandemics, or the reversal of climate change. Cooperative games externalize conflict and push the friend-foe distinction outwards. When looking inwards, however, they are essentially anti-political in both the Schmittian sense as well as the Rousseauian, as the general will is already formed without the players having any influence on it. Thereby, the political challenge of harmonizing diverging interests is replaced by a technical challenge. This is also the reason why cooperative board games are so drawn to calculation. Matt Leacock, the master of this genre, describes his games as logistical puzzles in which players delve into, quote, group-solving problems. And take his most recent game, Daybreak, co-designed with Matteo Menapes. And let me close with a few reflections on how to politicize it. In short, the game mechanics rely on what could be described as a pre-assembled general will to reverse climate change. Or to put it in more technical terms, the collective challenge of the player taking the role of geopolitical blocks to achieve drawdown by turn 6. That is, to reach a pivot point where global temperatures begin to decline again. The players lose when the temperature exceeds an upper threshold or if they fail to meet the basic needs of the populations they represent, breaching a lower threshold. And to be clear, I welcome the general intention of the game, to raise awareness about climate change and infuse our cultural imagination with solidarity. These are positive things. But beyond that, cooperative game designers deserve our highest respect because they work under higher difficulty settings. I think designing a compelling co-op game is like making vegan pastry or translating poetry, where even failure is already a noble achievement. That said, my concern is that the anti-political nature of Daybreak risks producing the utopian illusion that the climate crisis is primarily a matter of technical coordination rather than a political struggle of will formation. A starting point to resolve this could be to deepen the centrality of opportunity costs in the game. Another threat could be to strengthen the perspective of particular needs further in such a setting beyond a numeric value of demand. Maybe there should be something to maximize for some players in the sense of a constraint optimization problem rather than treating particular needs as something that must not fall below a certain level. But how could we address this in the game space? One serious problem when hacking cooperative games in this way is the rigid structure of winning conditions. Either there are no winning conditions, player win collectively, or third, or individual players or teams can win alone. One approach could be the introduction of a competitive layer by allowing for individual winning conditions into the game that remain hidden. In other words, one would introduce the possibility to defect into the game. A precedent for this is the anarchist game Block by Block, where players rise up together to liberate the city from the police. The game includes a semi-cooperative mode that allows players to betray the revolution. They can act as vanguardists and seize power for themselves. In Daybreak, something analogous could be introduced. Free riders unwilling to decarbonize, or the opportunity for players to invest in a space program, subtly withdrawing from planetary solidarity in pursuit of national salvation. What's compelling here is less the act of betrayal itself than how other players respond to it and how such disruptions transform the game's dynamic. Will players truly act in accordance with the general will, or are they pursuing their own agendas under its guise? Of course, this risks tipping the experience into paranoia of social deduction games like Mafia, where manipulation and mistrust dominate. But isn't this the world we inhabit? Still, my real interest is not the mere contestation of the common good, but the question whether we can turn the formation of the general will into a game itself. Perhaps this comes closer to Brecht's formulation of functional transformation. But I worry that such complex processes might not be possible to model through conventional tools like token economics and point systems. At least I have probably seen ways to implement this in a way that would actually be fun to play. So I close on a more open note by reaching out to the community for guidance and with the admission that the negativity of critique is always inferior to the positivity of creation. There's a cowardice in a critic's refusal to become a designer. And that's a step Max Haven did not shy away from, and I, for one, look very much forward to seeing some head rolls tonight. All right, that's my part.